Hey there guys, welcome back for another Indomitus painting video. This time we are taking a look at how I painted up my Primaris captain, and I have chosen obviously my army to represent the Dark Angels. So without further ado, let's take a look at how I got through this bad boy. So as you can see, I started off with a white primed undercoat on this model, and I painted any areas that were going to be painted in the Caliban green with Abaddon black first. Obviously I skipped this step just to avoid a little bit of a boring video here. I am trying to keep it as entertaining as possible. So you'll notice on this captain that I have taken the head that had no helmet. This was just the face of the captain, and I've used some modelling putty, or in this case it was green stuff, and just sculpted him a hood. It's not the cleanest sculpt ever. I very rarely make adjustments to models. I'm not great at customizations and things like that. I can do maybe swap out bits, bend an arm and a leg here and there, but when it comes to actually sculpting details, it's really not my thing. But I didn't have any hooded heads to swap in place of this, so I decided to just grab the green stuff, roll out and flatten out a relatively thin square of it, and then moulded it around the head using obviously the shape of the head to give the form to the hood. And then with a paper clip just unfolded, I just poked down the some of the green stuff down into the area around the neck, inside the body cavity there, to make it look as though the hood is coming out from underneath his chest armor plate. So you'll also notice that I have removed his arms and his shield and that, and his backpack. This is so that I can get to all the areas on this guy without getting paint on areas that I don't want to. The only exception to this is I can't get between the legs too well. However, later on I will remove the model from this base. He is not glued down, just so I can throw a little bit of colour up in there. It's not an easily noticeable place in there, so I'm not too fussed about it. But obviously everywhere else, I didn't want to leave some white areas or black areas behind shoulder pads and backpacks and things like that. So as you can see, the first layer here is just a straight over base coat, a couple of layers of Caliban green. Obviously this is thinned slightly, as I use all my paints slightly thinned, just to get that nice even coat on there without any brush strokes showing. And what I'm trying to do with this is take the green almost up to any harsh edges where I want some shadowing. So obviously where the boots step down, I leave a little bit of a gap there, and the same again with behind knee joints, anywhere basically where there's going to be a shadow. This does take, I'd say, about 4 or 5 coats to apply, just so I can get a little bit of a smooth gradient going from that black to the Caliban green. And basically I just keep applying this until I've got that strong opaque Caliban green with a bit of a fade off towards the black undercoat. What I do with this is apply this obviously over all the green areas that I want green on the main body itself, as well as all the components that I've removed. So that's the backpack, the shoulder pauldrons and the arms. The shield pretty much gets left until the end, and I'll explain why a little later on in the video for that. But what we'll do now is we'll jump ahead and take a look at what I do for the next level of painting on this guy. Okay, so with a good coat of Caliban green down, I now take some Warpstone Glow and I thin this quite a bit and start to use this as a glaze. And the idea that I'm looking for is obviously to blend this up from the Caliban green to almost a Warpstone Glow. I don't want this obviously over the whole armour. This is just meant for the highlight areas, as obviously being a Dark Angel they are supposed to be a dark green, but I do use this for where the light would hit the most on you know, flat surfaces, upturned edges and things like that. The light source I decided to have coming from the sort of the left side of the screen above the model slightly. So the model's upper right, that way the brighter highlights and stuff will be cast to the left side of the model as we're looking at it, with some of the shadow obviously on the inside and then the outer right side of the model. Now, as with glazing, the idea for this is to get the consistency of the paint so that as it dries you'll barely notice a difference for the first layer and maybe even the second layer, and then all you do is obviously gradually pull that in. Each subsequent layer gets pulled in so that you're covering a slightly less area than you did with the previous layer, so a smaller area, obviously working from where your shadows would be coming back to your highlights. At this point I'm not too worried about going into some of the recesses. For example, on the back of the leg he has this line that goes around the leg, and sort of zigzags up a little bit. So areas like that I'm not too worried, as I will go back in with a thinned down black or a Nuln Oil or something like that, and just very carefully line those areas in, as well as any shadow areas that have some of the darker green or brighter green go onto it. With this technique, obviously there's a lot of back and forth between colours, although the majority of what I managed to do is just blending and layering, glazing. But obviously every now and then a bit of paint will go where I don't want it, or doesn't quite blend so well, so I'll go back in with a thinned down Caliban green and just bring that back up to almost a Caliban green, and then go back over with the Warpstone Glow glaze to try and smooth out any transitions. If there are any harder edges, then I will take a 50-50 mix of Caliban green and Warpstone Glow, thin that down to a glaze, and then just go over that transition between the Caliban and the Warpstone. And if you can see the transition, I'll just blend that with the glaze. I'll layer that up until the transition smooths out, and then again on either side of that I will blend that back in. I know that's not the best explanation of this. If you guys want a more in-depth video, let me know and I'll try and readjust my camera angle to get a better angle on the model, and I will go in just on a small area of you know, a separate model and show you those techniques of how I do that exactly. Obviously that will be a fairly lengthy video, just due to how long it would take to layer and blend and things like that. But if it's something you guys want, let me know down in the comments below. And again, you know, I'm always happy and always looking for inspiration and ideas on videos that I can produce for you guys. So as long as I've got the models available, you know, I'm more than happy to try and do something that you guys want to see. So as you can see, as the layer goes on, or the glaze goes on wet, it's quite bright, and then it will dull down slightly and you know, sort of blend in with the layer below it. And the idea, as I said, is just to glaze this up until it's not quite a warpstone glow colour. I don't want it that bright, but near enough that it is a nice bright highlight on there. And then I'll use that same warpstone glow to highlight areas in the shadow areas. Again, I'll show that as I reach that point. But the reason I don't want an edge highlight of my brightest green in the shadow areas is obviously it would look wrong, because you wouldn't get those bright highlights there, but you will get some reflective highlights in shadow areas. And so it's better to go with your mid-tone in your shadow areas for highlights there, and then in your brighter areas use a bright highlight. So as I said before, I'm working on the whole model on this, with exception to the shield, just because that uses different colours, although he does have his hand there, so obviously I am working on that little bit there. You'll also notice that I'm using sticky tack or blue tack with a paper clip just pushed into the holes that are in the back of the arms and that, just to give them a little bit of stability. I'm a little bit wary when it comes to using super glue and things like that, because it can leave a bit of a blob there that you then have to try and scrape away to be able to get the pegs in. But you know, a bit of blue tack and a paper clip does just fine for me, with exception to the shield. I can basically hold that while I'm painting the hand, and then paint the back of that. Just you know, a quick simple job, because it's just the back of the shield. And then I can attach it to the model, and then go ahead and paint the front in full detail. So as you can see here, I'm just working on the backpack here, taking into account the rounded outer edges, the ball type shapes. So obviously my glow is going to be a little bit more rounded there, and then obviously there's the slight underglow. And now I did go off camera a couple of times with this, guys, and I have cropped in to try and get a better zoom on the main model itself. So what I'll do here is skip on ahead to the next step, so you can see what we do for the next area of highlight. Okay, so you can see here the level of highlights that I went up to with that warpstone glow, and what I'm doing now is using a slightly less watered version of it, so that it will be a little bit more opaque against the green that I've already applied. Like I said, I didn't go full opacity with the glazing, and all I'm doing is just going around all the edges and adding in the first edge highlight. Now this isn't going to stand out so much on the brighter areas, as obviously it's already got the warpstone glow there, but because this is a little bit more opaque than what I took the glazes up to, it does show enough that it gives a gentle highlight. And then obviously in any shadow areas, this will give a slightly better highlight, obviously with the green against the dark green or the black, you're going to get a little bit more of a brighter definition between the two. You're going to notice that contrast. So as you can see here, just very carefully going around anywhere that I think the highlights would be. That's just around the little markings that he's got at the bottom of his foot there, or his leg. Obviously light would hit the collar, the top of his neck brace or collar, whatever that part is. So as I said, just going around everything. And here I'm going around the line that I mentioned earlier, and just picking off the top and the bottom of the line. Now although the light will catch the bottom more, I put this highlight on both sides of the line, and then the brighter highlight will then go on the bottom, and that just makes everything stand out a little bit more. So again, this isn't fully out of the pot opaque. This has been watered down a little bit to get it to flow a little bit better. and make sure that there's no blobbing or anything as I put these lines in, which does mean it takes a couple of layers, couple of passes to get up to the brightness that I want. But we'll jump on ahead and take a look at the next area. Okay, so for the final layer of highlight here, I've now taken some moot green, and I'm just going around all of the places where I want that brightest highlight. This has been thinned down a little bit, A, to get it to flow better, and B, so that it gives, you know, a little bit of a soft transition, but not too much that you won't notice it. And all I'm doing is just picking out areas where I want the brightest highlights to be. So obviously that's anywhere any sharp edges the sunlight is most likely to catch. So it's the you know, a little spot in the top of the knee, as it's a rounded object. The same with the boots, a small edge highlight on the edges of them, the corner pieces of certain areas, and I'll just come into the highlight slightly of the previous highlight, and that way it just gives the impression of light being picked off on those corners. So we'll jump on and take a look at the next step once all of this green has done. So I'll catch you in just a second, guys. Right, and with all the highlighting done, this is where I'm at. So the next step is to take some Rhinox hide and use this as the base for all my leather areas. So that's the belt here. And obviously he's got the bit that dangles down, and then what goes around his waist, as well as the pouches on his back. I think he's got a pistol pouch back there. So again, just a couple of slightly thinned coats, and then on to the next level of highlight. I think the reason I'm working with completing areas with this is just so I know that I'm going from step to step to step, rather than bouncing backwards and forwards between putting all the base colours on, then the mid-tones, then the highlights and things like that. Obviously the downside is making sure that I don't get paint on areas that I've already done to completion, but the plus side to the armour being segmented is that if I do get a bit of paint on one area, I only have to repaint that small section. For example, the little plates that he's got on his thighs, if I've got a bit of brown on there, I could just go back over with black, Caliban green, and work my way up with that back to where I was. So I wasn't too worried. So now I'm just applying some Xander Dust as a base coat for the robes. Obviously these are going to be a very pale tan colour, not quite bleached bone or anything like that, but definitely a paler cloth. Okay, so next up I take some Seraphim Sapia. Anyway, this I use this slightly watered down, so again it's coming off the wet palette, not from the pot, and I'm just applying this to any of the deeper recesses to get a bit of a shadow in there. Obviously I'm then going to blend over this later on with lighter layers, as well as going back with a little bit of very thin down sepia wash to use almost as a glaze, so I can get a nice blend between the two. So obviously I'm just applying this, and then I'll set it aside for 15-20 minutes to let that fully dry before moving on to the next step. Right, so as you can see, I decided to take the sepia and give a coat to the whole robe area to darken it up, and then using the Xander Dust thinned down to a little bit thicker than glaze consistency, I then work in layers, blending up to get it back to that Xander Dust. The reason I did this was when I applied it to the recesses, I wasn't happy so much with the way that it just stained into the recesses and didn't have that gradual blend that I wanted on this model. I want everything to be smooth and clean and crisp, you know, with nice blends. It's a character model, so it needs that extra little bit of attention to detail. So obviously the same as I did with the armour, I'm just working with multiple layers of glazes, going anywhere where I think light would touch. Obviously with the hood here, I'm trying to leave some definition with a little bit of shadowing, mainly on the sides and in some natural dips that formed as I was sculpting the hood, and then obviously leaving down in that depth around his neck a little bit dark. And because the light source is coming from the top left of the model, obviously I need the left side of the robes and armour and things like that to have that brighter finish to it. So obviously I'm just building that up until I get that nice bright finish up on the top area. Right, and once I'm happy with the level of highlight with that, I'm now going to take some Ushapti Bone, and this is thinned down slightly, but it is meant to be a little bit more of a edge highlight, so it doesn't quite need that gradual blend to it. It can be a little bit sharper, a little bit crisper. So again, just going over any areas I think will have that brighter highlight. For the top of the hood here, obviously I'm just sort of patching it in. I feel that gives it a little bit more texture, rather than just having flat highlight on there or just edge highlighting. And obviously with him, just be careful to pick anywhere where sort of flat surfaces and the flatter areas are going to pick up the most light. As I said, this is thinned down a little bit, so there will be a bit of a step to it, but not too much as if it was out of the pot with a little bit of water. So it's not quite glaze consistency, but it's enough that I can get a bit of a nice nice edge to it, or nice highlight with it. And the idea with this is just to get texture and detail into the robe. I do come back later and add a little bit more texture with it and a little bit more blending with the Xander Dust glaze. But for now, the robe is almost done. So there we go. I'm just blending that up just to get that a little bit smoother there. So we'll just jump on ahead and move on to the next step. Okay, so now I move back to the leather and taken some Doom Bull Brown. I'm just edge highlighting the edge of the belt here, and what I'm doing is slightly, this is thinned down obviously as always, but what I'm doing is just sort of slightly touching in towards the leather, so it's on the edge and then just slightly brought in, almost dotted, but it brings a slight stroke down into the leather just to give the effect of some wear. So obviously this is going to be done all around the top and bottom edge of the belt. This isn't an exact highlight, this is more where the edges of the leather has been worn and creased up and sort of started to flake away and dry out and things like that. So first of all, it's just a small highlight around, and then I just gently pull the tip in and just as you can see, just sort of dot along and just give a little bit of a, basically rough that edge up slightly. You know, you don't want a thick line going down there, you want a nice crisp edge, and then rough that up with the tip of your brush. And obviously following any sort of raised creases and things like that. So next up I take some Xander Dust, and this is going to be for that that area of leather that's underneath the surface. When you get cracked leather, it dries out a little bit and goes sort of a little bit brighter. So again, the same thing, but this is just focusing on more on corners and anywhere that's going to have some harsher drying out and cracking. So these are broken up lines. You don't want a straight line going right down the length of a highlight area. Just break it up a little bit, and it'll give a nice bit of cracked leather look. So obviously I'm now doing the same with the belt, being careful not to oversize these small strokes. Obviously you have to try and keep it to scale. You don't want thick lines coming off there. These do have to be very fine, as they are fine cracks. So now that that's done, I'm going to take some Mephiston red, and we're going to start painting up the shield. So whilst it's obviously unattached from the arm, I'm just going in, obviously this is thinned down, and just basically applying 2 to 3 layers on the back, and I think I end up doing the front of the model as well, as a first layer I can touch up. Obviously with this I'm not too fussed about going into any of the recesses. It's got that indentation that follows around the edge, that gives the edge a bit of a trim, as again I'll just run a black wash into that, and that will just bring that back to a nice dark crisp line in there. So obviously you can see that I'm not too worried about rubbing some of the black off of the outer edges that I'm holding on to. Once it's placed back onto his arm, I can go back over, paint them in black, and then go in with the gold that I have around the edge. So it's just about getting the base coat on there first. You'll also note that on here I have removed the skeleton that sits in the middle there, and that's so that I can get the red behind where he would be. I did attempt to paint it, or I did look at it with him on there when I was doing the black, and I just couldn't quite get it underneath him to get the right look. Right, so we'll jump up on ahead and be back in just a tick. Right, so next I decided to do all the gold areas, and for this I took a base of Balthazar gold. Now I did debate whether to do this in non-metallic metals, but I'm not the best at it. I've only done 4 or 5 models with non-metallics on them, and seeing as this has lots of very small pieces, like these emblems and stuff that he's got here, I'm trying to get a non-metallic metal effect on those. I felt was just a little bit out my comfort zone, so what I've opted for instead is to go for a true metallic metal. So I'm using various shades of, or various tones of golds for this. So obviously the base gold is the Balthazar gold, and then I'll work up with the next gold, which will be thinned down to almost a glaze, so that I can get that blend from the darker gold to a lighter gold, and then on top of that will be a final highlight of gold, followed by some edge highlighting of a silver in very much the same way we did with the moot green on the green areas, so just in key points to give a little bit of reflection. Obviously you don't want to overpower the gold with a bunch of silver lines on it. So obviously area wise on this, I decided to do the whole of his right knee, as it had the skull on there, and just felt that it would be, you know, he's a captain, he's going to be layered in golds and, you know, purity seals and everything else that will make a captain stand out. So I went ahead with the whole of his right knee, and then on his left knee it was just the top trim, the small diamond shaped spikes that go up to his knee, I kept them green. And then obviously we've got the skull on the side here, excuse me, as well as some of the emblems around his shield and, you know, the rest of him. You'll also notice that the chest plate piece that he has his company motif on, I think you call it, I'm not quite sure what it's called, but the piece that would be on his chest plate, obviously I took that off as well so that I could get the eagle emblem, the wings and that painted behind that without that impeding anything. And again, I'll get to that part a little later on in the video. I think this guy took me a little around 6 hours to paint. I know that I ended up with about no, it's probably about 4.5 hours. I ended up with about 6 hours of video, but obviously that was with a bit of drying time and settling, you know, stopping to make sure I got the camera angle right and things like that. Making sure that I'm in focus some of the time. Obviously can't get it all the time. So yeah, this was about 4.5 hours total paint time if I wasn't filming. So to break it down into whatever length of video this comes up at the end, obviously I've sped the video up to try and keep it as short as possible whilst explaining as much as possible. So I'll just jump on ahead here and we'll take a look at what we've got once this is done. Okay, so back to the shield now. I'm going to take some Evil Sun's Scarlet, and as usual this has been thinned down to pretty much a glaze consistency, and again I'll just layer this up to get that blend from dark to light. Obviously with the inside of the shield, I'm just focusing the light areas on the outside edges of the shield where the light will access a little bit. Obviously he is holding it standing up rather than close to his body, so there is going to be some light that will get behind there. Obviously I'm not too worried now about removing any paint with my fingers at this stage. I find that as long as you hold the piece gently enough, it's not a problem. So now I'm just running in some Ushapti Bone over all of the purity seals. The reason I haven't done the front of the shield yet is, as I said, I'm just looking to get the back of the shield finished, and then I can attach it to his hand or his arm and finish off the front once that's attached to the model, which will give it a bit of stability and make it a little bit easier to paint up. Okay, so back to the gold. I'm taking a 50-50 mix of Balthazar gold and Retributor armor. As golds can't be thinned down too much without them sort of breaking up and dulling out. Obviously I've mixed these two together and then given it a 2:1 paint to water ratio just to thin it a little bit, so that I can get a smooth transition from that Balthazar gold up to this, and then I'll go over the top of this with some thinned down Retributor armor on its own. So just the same as I would with any other paint and highlighting method, I'm picking off the majority of the areas where I feel the light would hit the most. Obviously leaving shadow areas, which is the Balthazar gold. So obviously as we get to the shoulder pads here, that's the majority of the bottom area, and then as we get to the corners, I'm leaving that or feathering that out to become the pure Balthazar gold. So you've got the darker corners and then the brighter flatter surface and the top area. You notice on this arm that I'm leaving everything but the sword. The sword will be pretty much the last thing that I do on this model, as I was not too sure on whether I wanted to go with a metallic look or a non-metallic power sword type effect, and I'll let you see when we get there as to which I've chosen. So obviously going over all of the Balthazar gold areas, making sure we pick up those highlights. So for the halo part here, that's just anywhere on the surface, the flatter areas that the light would hit. It's the top part of each of the spikes that come off there, not the underside obviously. And the same with the dome area of the skull. And with the shield, I obviously pick out the bottom rounded areas, or bottom area of the rounded parts, and then leave the edges and the corners with the original Balthazar gold. And because the shield is slightly curved, there's going to be a little bit more of a highlight towards the centre of the shield, on the top and the bottom, and then a little bit vertical on the outside edges. So I think you can see in some of the light as I move this around, you can see that transition a little bit easier from this gold to the Balthazar, and you can sort of get an idea of the effect that it's having. The problem with true metallic metal painting is cameras don't tend to pick up the differences too much, because the light source of either the flash or the light that I have shining on the model tends to react with the metals within the paint and give a highlight to it all anyway, so it sort of washes out anything that you've really done. But in person it does look, you know, it does look nice, and especially when it's on the tabletop, in amongst your armies, and you've got this nice officer there with all this shiny gold. It's definitely something I prefer to do than the non-metallics. So now I'm going back in with just Retributor armour, and again, same as before, just picking off the very edge highlights of everything, just smoothing everything out a little bit, getting that transition up to the gold, edge highlighting, and picking off the top surfaces. Right, and for the final highlight points, I take some Stormhost silver, and as it turns out, I may have painted the shield, or a lot more of the shield, than I originally thought I did. This was painted a week prior to doing the voiceover for this and the editing. Obviously with some of my other videos that I've been releasing, I've just been trying to get these videos painted up and then editing them a day or two before they end up on YouTube. So memory isn't too fresh with it, but I don't think that's too much of a problem for you guys. So as you can see, I'm just picking out the outside edges and sort of sharp edges, points and corners, things like that, with this silver, just to give where that light would reflect and make that gold look almost white. I used to do my edge highlighting with white on gold, and obviously after a while I realised that that's quite an amateur thing to do, as white is a matte dull colour and it just doesn't quite work with the gold. So I find that Stormhost silver is one of the better silvers, or silver metallics, to use for edge highlighting and point highlighting on gold. Okay, so next up, onto some lead Belcher, and this is for any of those metallic areas that obviously aren't gold, and the Stormhost silver would just be too bright to use for that. So it's things like the belt buckle, chains, the metallic part of this vial thing that he's got dangling from here. I'm not too sure what that is. So I just made it a red vial, or a vial of blood or something like that. It does seem something, I wouldn't say religious, as I don't really class 40k as any kind of religion, but definitely something that has some sort of religious meaning to him. If you guys do know what that is, then let me know down in the comments. But yeah, I decided to just do it as a vial of blood. Maybe it's the Emperor's blood or something like that, or the blood of a fallen. So obviously the other metallic parts here are the exhaust vents and the other parts of the backpack there, as well as the chain that he has for his emblems. I was debating whether to do this chain as beads, but I thought that might be a bit too much to go in with over the top. So next up, I take some Ushapti Bone, and this is now going over all of the purity seals. Now what I did with this was I applied the Seraphim Sapia wash over all of the seals, but I forgot to record that little bit, and then I went back over with Xander Dust, and what I did was, rather than paint it solid, I did the same as what I'm doing here and just draw it, basically painting lines, very thin lines, very close together, along the flat surface of the scrolls or seals, whatever you want to call these bits. And I do that the same with each level of highlight that I use on these, just to give it a bit more of a ragged, sort of roughed up, heavily creased kind of look to them. It stops them being so flat, then it just gives a bit more texture really. Okay, so with the purity seals almost done to completion, I'm now taking some non-oil. This is a mix, a 50-50 mix of non-oil and water, in one of the older, smaller pots that the washes and oils originally came in. So this is an older pot, and when it got to about halfway down, I then topped it up with water to give a thin down wash. And obviously you can see that I'm just going around anything that I want this wash to fill in. Because it is watered down, it does not sit on the surfaces like regular non-oil would, so it's just gives a nice bit of depth to all those shadow areas. Okay, so coming towards the end stages now, although not the end of the video just yet. I'm now, obviously, as you can see, I've attached everything to the model. This hasn't been glued in, as I will remove it once done, just so I can remove them from the base to paint the base separately. But here I'm just taking some of that Wild Rider red, and obviously it's still thinned down to a glaze consistency, and I'm just highlighting all the areas, or bringing it up to a highlight for all the areas that I think the light would catch. Obviously the shield is slightly curved, so as I said, it's going to have this brighter area in the middle, and then the darker either side of it, and then the edge highlights right up against where that line, that indentation border is. Now I haven't gone into that yet with any black or oil, so that's still, I'm not too worried about getting the red in there. I find that if I'd gone in with the black and then tried doing these edge highlights, there's a chance that I could get the red back in there where I'm so close to the edge. So it's easier to do that. If I get the red in there, the black will cover that, and as long as I use a fine tipped brush with a nice point to it, I can pretty much run that black wash right in there without getting it on the red or the gold. So obviously I'm just building this up a small amount at a time, and just getting that nice bright red on that shield there. So now I'm just going in with some black and just neatening up some of those dark areas there. Okay, so I've now added a small amount of Pallid witch flesh to the black just to lighten it up to a little bit more of a grey, and I'm just using that as an edge highlight. Okay, so you'll notice that I've gone and attached the Necron and the skeleton to the figure and painted up some of the base, and the skeleton on the shield I went ahead and pre-painted with Ushapti Bone, and I'm now going in with some Reichland Flesh Shade just to give that some shade and definition. I prefer this over the Agrax Earth Shade as it has a little bit more of a reddish tone to it. So obviously just going over some of the banner and stuff here as well, although I do think I touched that back up later the same way that I did with the other banners, the other purity seals, sorry. And I'm now just washing some into his face. His face just had a straight paint of or a straight coat of white scar, and now with this will be the first layer of shading just to get some depth into his face there. And now I go over all the banners and the purity seals and stuff with the same Reichland Flesh Shade to bring them all together. Okay, so next I'm just going to take some Ushapti Bone, and this is thinned down a little bit, and I'm just going over the whole of the skeleton, basically just giving him a top edge highlight to bring that back up to a more bone looking colour. So obviously I apply this over all of the skeleton, being careful not to, or not so much careful, but just taking note of what areas are skeleton and what areas are these sort of rings that he has around his wrist, plus some of the bolts in his shoulders and things like that. I'm assuming, as he must be a fallen space marine, that would be some of his modifications and stuff that they have done to them. So obviously I'll go in and paint them separately once I have this bone down. Okay, and once the Ushapti Bone is done, I'm now taking some Pallid witch flesh and adding that final layer of highlight to the skeleton here. So obviously that's just any sort of highest point raised edges along the bone, the arm, the brow, the knuckles, you know, things like that. A little bit around the one or the eye, whatever it is that he has in the centre of his forehead. And yeah, just picking that off where I think, again, where the light would hit the most. Right, I'm now taking some corn red, and this is going to be for the wax seal on the purity seals. So obviously just a straight base over the top of all of those. I will say that once I finished with the flayed one flesh on the skeleton, I then went in with the same gold technique that I used for the rest of the armour, just to do up his bangles and things like that. So obviously there was no point in me including that part of the video. It's exactly the same and takes 30 seconds when sped up to 300%. So yeah, like I say, just going around with corn red and filling out all these purity seals, obviously being careful to make sure I get the sides of them, but not getting that red paint on anything else. The reason I went for the corn red, obviously I wanted something to stand out. You know, I didn't want the same red as the Mephiston and Wild Rider red. This one for the purity seals, I wanted a little bit more of a pinkish red, especially for the highlight, just so they stand out a lot more. You'll notice that I also took that Seraphim Sapir wash and applied that all over the chest plate eagle, and then went back in. That was thinned down just so that it would sit in all the recesses, and that just gives a little bit more definition between everything then. Okay, so next up, just taking some pink horror, and this is just to go around as a edge highlight for the wax part of the purity seals. So just picking off the top of each one, and if they have a little skull in there, then just a small point on the skull. Nothing too crazy, just enough to give a bit of a highlight. Okay, so next up I'm just taking a mix of Xander Dust and Ushapti Bone, and I'm just going to use this to paint the large banner that goes across the front of the model here, or front of the shield. I haven't written anything on the banner. I'm not too sure what to write or what I could fit in that area yet, so I have left it blank, as with the emblem on his left shoulder plate. I've not put the squad marking on there yet either. So as you can see, I'm just going around picking off edge highlights on the banner and then feathering in some highlight and then blending that back out with some glazes and stuff. I think the majority of this model was done with glazes and layering and blending, but obviously, you know, that's the way to get the smoothest effect with brush. So although I'm going over the purity seals here, the same as I did before with that sort of stroked lines across it, I do then go over all of those with white scar. To obviously here I'm using pure Ushapti Bone, as I decide that they're too similar to the banner on the front, and I wanted them to stand out a little bit. So what I'm now doing here is, with the Ushapti Bone thinned down a little bit, I'm actually cross hatching over the highlights and a little bit into some of the shading on the robe, just to give a little bit of texture. Although it doesn't stand out too much on camera, again, it's one of those things that in person you'll notice a lot more. But this is very, very thin, fine line work that just gives a little bit of that crossed, interweaved fabric, you know, like heavy wool or thick cotton, something like that. Okay, so here I'm just going to take some Pallid witch flesh, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm going over all of the purity seal scrolls with this. Again, just very, very fine strokes. I have slowed the video down here back to normal speed, otherwise there's not enough video to get me some commentary in. But you can see here I'm just doing very fine lines across the banner, or across the cloth, or whatever that stuff is made out of. I assume it would be some sort of fabric, if not a heavy parchment. So this again just to add some texture, so that it's not just a flat colour with edge highlighting. So I go around and apply this to all of the purity seals and these sort of straggly bits. You'll also notice that I've attached his shoulder plate there with the markings of the 5th company. So I'm having him as a 5th company sergeant, captain, and all my marines will be 5th company, with exception to the Blade Guard and the Blade Guard veteran, which are obviously 1st company, so they are in Deathwing colours, and the Outriders are in 2nd company, so they will be in Ravenwing colours. I know a lot of Dark Angels fans are not too happy about the Primaris being put into those ranks, but Games Workshop, they did manage to get it into canon, so you know, there they are. And I have to admit, the Blade Guard, they do look awesome in bone colours of 1st company. Okay, so now I'm adding some final highlights to the shield here with some Wild Rider red. So this is a little bit more of an orangey red. So you know, I'm being a little bit careful with it. I don't want to overpower the red too much, and this has been thinned down a little bit, so it's not going to be too contrast anyway. But this is just going around all these edges where that black trim or indentation meets up with between the gold and the red there. Okay, so now on to the sword. For this I've obviously got a black undercoat, and I'm now taking some Sotek green and again just applying a couple of thinned layers over this to get a nice even coverage. And obviously I've decided to go for a non-metallic power sword look, but it is a little bit different to what most painters will do power swords. I'm not a huge fan of the light dark light and then dark light dark transition from hilt to point. I prefer to have it more how light would work, with the reflection on the top half and then darker on the bottom half, and then again slightly lighter on the inside top and then darkest on the inside bottom half of the blades. I just feel that that's how, you know, for me it looks a little bit better. I prefer the look of it. So apologies for coming off camera here, but trying to paint this the right way or upside down and keep it in camera doesn't leave me too much room, but it's just basically applying a nice even coat of the Sotek green. Okay, so next I move on to detailing the face, and for this I'm just using some flayed one flesh and just picking off highlights. Obviously with having the white followed by the Reichland flesh shade, that's already given me some shading to the skin, some skin tone with shadows in recessed areas. So all I really have to do now is just pick off some of those highlight areas with this, and then another layer of highlight on top of that. Because he is under a hood, I don't have to go crazy with highlights. He is quite shadowed, so I can get a nice bit of shadow effect on his face, and basically just pick out the highlights on his nose, his brow, and a little bit on his lip. So again, I'm not doing this with glazes. There's no need for faces. It's actually better to go in with slightly more opaque and layer up and blend rather than glaze up. Just sort of spot on the highlights. Now this may have been easier to do with the head removed, but because the hood had to be sculpted in over the top of the head, I couldn't do them separate, and I didn't want to paint the head up, put that in, and then sculpt the hood over the top, and then try and paint the inside of the hood and mess up the face. So, you know, I'm working this way. Okay, so with the face done, it's time to move back to the sword. So I'm just taking some Ahriman blue here, and again this is all glazes, and all I'm doing is applying the highlights to the top edge of the top front portion of the blade, and then the bottom half. So as I said, it's not a light dark light or light shadow light and then shadow light shadow. This is from dark to light on the top, and then from light to dark on the bottom, but with the bottom being darker in tone than the top half of the blade. It will make a little bit more sense as we see it progress, but again, this is something that I will do a separate video on, how I paint power swords up this way. So the idea is that if you imagine the center point of the blade being the divider between light and dark, the top part of it is the lightest, the bottom half will be slightly darker, then the top side of the inside of the blade will be the same in value as the bottom on the outside of the blade, and then the inside will be the darkest cut, or the inside bottom will be the darkest. So I'm now going in with adding some Pallid witch flesh to the blue, just to brighten it up a little bit, and again glazing up and letting each layer dry. I don't get this perfect first time. I do have to go back in and neaten up a few areas, blend it back. Also, I don't fully wait for it to dry in one point, and I end up with the horrible tide mark. But I found that with glazing you can get away with this if you're careful with it and sort of blob a bit of the glaze in within the tide mark. It will actually blend out and fill it in as though it wasn't there. So now I'm just running some preliminary edge highlighting down the length of the blade, just working out where my highlights are gonna go. And like I say, this, I do go back in and change this slightly, mainly just in the way that I have my highlight on the top and the bottom of the blade. So it is just a case of blending these up and getting to that highlight point right on the tip end. But we'll jump on and see the next step. Okay, so once I've got the brightest point of the blade as bright as I want it, I'm now taking some Dragonhof Nightshade and applying this as a sort of glaze, working the opposite way round. So I'm now applying the shadow. So as you can see, I'm pretty much leaving the top portion of the blade, just going into the center and then bringing it down to the hilt, just to add some shadow down there. And then I glaze this over more on the underside of the blade there, to add some shadow. And then the same here with the top half of the inside blade. I'll match that so that the bottom half that I'm doing here matches the top half on the inside, and then I darken up the bottom half of the inside as much as I can. And again, this is a case of going backwards and forwards between the shadow, or the Dragonhof Nightshade, and the lighter blue, until it's at a point where I'm happy that the transitions are nice and the tone between the parts of the blade are nice. So now I'm going in with some lighter blue. This just had a little bit of white scar mixed in with it to pale it up slightly, and I'm just doing all the edge highlighting all the way down and around the blade. Obviously a little bit less on the inside. I'm just trying to sort of feather it a little bit there, and then back over with a bit of a glaze just to blend it back up again. Now I'm just adding in some highlight lines where that sort of reflective light is going to come across the top of the blade, and then just very finely picking down the center of the blade with the highlight, and then obviously I'll run around the top tip and the top portion of the blade. And then again glazing over the top to pull that back in. If you do pure highlights over the top on something like this, it tends to stand out too much, and it looks better just to blend it back down into the rest of the blade. So obviously some slight highlights on the inside there, and then blending it back down on the bottom with similar highlights. And there it is, guys. Apologies for losing a little bit of footage there, but all I've done after finishing the blade is just gone back in with some gold and just touched up or painted in the rod piece that goes up the blade slightly on the inside and outside edge. Obviously with the base and that, I haven't shown that as it's relatively simple. The same with any kind of pre-modelled base. The stone area was just a base of Eshin Grey dry brushed with Dawnstone, and the earth was Xander Dust dry brushed with, I believe it was possibly Dryad bark, but I can't remember exactly. The Necron is based on my army that I'm painting from the Indomitus set, so if you want to see how that was done, I'll put a card up in the corner here for the Necron Lord that I painted and posted last week, so you can go and check that one out, and you'll see there how I got the Necron effect there. So yeah, that's the end of this video. Thanks a lot everyone for joining me. I hope you stuck around to the end of this. If you did, massive thank you to you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hit that thumbs up button and hit that subscription button if you're not already subscribed. Obviously this video is part of my painting in Indomitus set, which is every Wednesday. I also do the Mortal Realms Mondays, which focuses on the Mortal Realms magazine from Hatchet Park Works. So go and check that out as well if you're into Warhammer Fantasy. That's all about that. Obviously video for that every Monday, and as well as the Indomitus set and the Mortal Realms, I am planning on doing further videos and series focusing on other areas of Games Workshop models, as well as models and miniatures from other companies and other games. So if there's anything in particular that you guys would like to see, let me know down in the comments of any future videos, and I'll see what I can come up with. But until next time, thanks a lot guys, take it easy and keep painting those minis.